At that moment, the head of the disciplinary committee, who couldn't stand fighting on campus, appeared right behind them. Jimmy knew they were the victims of an attack, but right now his friend didn't look like a victim at all, but like an enraged killer. Looking back, Henry also realized that he would have to find an excuse for what had happened, because Julia would probably want to hear all the details of the incident. The girl approached the thug lying on the ground and at first could not understand who could have maimed this strong guy so badly. And then she suddenly laughed loudly, realizing that this skinny freshman was able to cope with such a serious opponent. It was unclear why Julia had come here in person, knowing that a deadly battle was taking place here. Looking at him sternly, the girl stated that she knew Henry's sister very well and wanted to know where she was right now. Realizing that the guy suspected her of having a secret relationship with Sophia, Julia asked him to give way and not get in the way. In fact, it was not worth telling him about it in such a tone, because just recently the guy had gone through an ordeal that could have ended in death for him. It's good that at that moment Sophia arrived, who noticed from afar the brewing conflict between her friends. However, Julia did not calm down and stated that she came here on behalf of the committee in order to administer justice. But the fact that they all remained intact was entirely due to Henry, and this was worth remembering first and foremost. At some point, the guy became rude and Sophia stopped him in time, asking him to calm down. The jokes that her friend usually threw around turned out to be quite funny and Sophia couldn't even hold back her laughter. For example, he joked that Julia's breasts were fake, to which she loudly declared that she had never had plastic surgery and that everything was natural. In fact, she is used to taking a hit and deflecting any barbs, because since childhood she has been used to keeping herself in hand and not falling for provocations. And in a situation where a wealthy young woman meets a poor boy, it was absolutely necessary to show restraint and not start shouting. However, right now she still couldn't hold back and, pointing her finger at him, declared that this puppy should know his place. Julia believed that by arguing with her, the guy was playing with fire and risked not only being expelled from the academy, but also running into her personal security. At that moment, instead of fear, the guy, following Sophia, could barely hold back his laughter at how ridiculously the girl was imitating her mentor Michelle. But Jimmy warned in time that everything this student said was true, and that she could really have a big impact on his friend's life. Besides, her family roots go back so far that even the founders of this academy are in her lineage, so you shouldn't joke with her. Despite this, the guy did not give in, and Julia could not believe that Henry could sacrifice even his education at the academy. Although in reality, she believed that all this bragging of the first-year student was only because Sophia was now next to him. And if he decided to enter into a long argument with her, then she was also ready to continue the conflict, because she was never used to giving in to fighters of lower rank. At some point, it seemed to everyone that the dispute would never end, as the young people sent streams of insults at each other. Sophia knew that Henry always behaved like this, although today he could give in to the girl a little and thereby end their argument. In fact, the situation was completely under Henry's control, and the guy only asked that Sophia not interfere with him. At the very beginning, she saw who was actually the instigator of today's fight, which Henry had not yet managed to finish. Suddenly, the girl laughed loudly after Henry admitted that he was the one who wanted to start a fight with Vincent as soon as possible. But then she stopped, realizing that the guy had much more serious intentions than it might seem from his appearance. The argument finally ended, and Henry headed straight for the bastard, who was still lying on the platform. Turning to Julia, he suddenly asked whether they had ever met in the past, or whether they had never met before. The girl immediately understood what the guy was hinting at, because on the very first day of his rebirth, he found her in the bushes in an unsightly state. She didn't want everyone else to know about it and threw up her hands, saying that she was seeing the guy for the first time. It's good that she understood his hint, because if she continues to behave like this, she risks being ridiculed. In response, Julia simply showed a simple and clear gesture, expressing in it her entire attitude towards this cunning scoundrel. And while Vincent's street gang did deserve serious punishment, they shouldn't have started a fight in a public place. If Henry himself admitted that he was the one who started the fight, then he should have gone with her to the special training unit. Yes, it seems she decided to go all the way, and at the end, Henry only had time to ask what would happen if he refused. But Julia already had a prepared answer, and she said that it was better for him not to take risks. The wristwatch that Sophia gave the guy suddenly informed him that Julia's power level was too high for him. And although she didn't seem like a smart and intelligent girl to him, she still occupied first place in the ranking of the Academy's cultivators. The immortal spirit also warned that this girl's aura was similar to the energy of some celestials, and the guy should not compete with her in the power of magic. However, today this student ran into a person who didn't care about her level, as well as about all her threats. Vincent knew that Charlie had decided to hit on Sophia, but instead of responding, he received such a blow to the face that he was forced to lie in the hospital for a long time. And if Henry's friend had such power, then one could only guess what kind of power this student himself possessed. Only the strongest student in the academy, like Julia, could compete with such an opponent, although it was difficult to say who would win. Of course, Vincent wanted Julia to win, because he wanted to see with his own eyes the death of the puppy who managed to win their battle. At the last moment, Jimmy warned that his friend was taking a big risk by taking this step and meeting Julia face to face. Sophia also tried to dissuade her friend, because there was no point in getting angry at the guy who himself became a victim of today's attack. But she sadly replied that she could no longer take a step back, because then her image in the eyes of all the students would drop to zero. Besides, she didn't want to let the scoundrel who dared to raise his hand against her beloved girl go unpunished, and decided to change her plan a little. According to the stories in the book she had read, to make someone obey your opinion, you need to say a few words to them. Turning to Sophia, she suddenly said the words she had learned from an old book, and it sounded a little strange. At first, Sophia was confused, not understanding what Julia wanted to say and what she was trying to achieve with her words. Then Julia suddenly uttered some scary, memorized phrases that turned out to be completely inappropriate and only frightened Sophia. Sophia asked Julia not to do that anymore, because she always looked scary, and there was no point in scaring everyone around her with these creepy spells. It's time to continue the showdown between Kieran and the one who dared to attack him. Yes, it was Vincent who was talking about, who screamed loudly in fear, realizing what this confrontation threatened him with. All his limbs were broken, and he could have brought even greater trouble upon himself if he had begun to object. The big guy realized that his opponent would not stop and decided to humiliate him in front of all the students. Of course, Vincent, who had accepted the order, was the only one to blame for the quarrel. But he was not going to put up with humiliation. He loudly declared that Henry himself was to blame for everything, having dared to go against Charlie, whose father was a famous and influential man. After these words, everyone realized that Vincent, the terror of the freshmen, had finally lost his nerve. Henry, realizing that the goal had been achieved, changed his tone and said that the conflict could be considered resolved. But that wasn't the end of it, because after the first stage they had a second skirmish with the big guy. Since he dared to raise his hand against defenseless girls and beat them, Henry was going to take away his abilities so that he could no longer cultivate and pose a threat. Vincent was ready to do anything, even endure cruel punishment, but began to beg not to deprive him of his abilities. But from the terrible smile that flashed across Henry's face, it was clear that the decision had been made, and it didn't matter whether Vincent would give up his abilities or not. Henry could have killed him right now because Vincent was lying nearby, like a convenient victim for a predator. It was strange that Julia, who was nearby and represented the disciplinary committee, did not stop this. But what was the guy hinting at? Yes, it was a reproach both to Julia and as the head of the disciplinary committee. She could not let the bully get away with something like that. Julia used the force she had recently threatened Henry with but had hesitated to use. Vincent was less fortunate and felt the full power of this student, who was rightfully considered one of the strongest in the academy. With fury in her eyes, she watched the scoundrel who dared to raise his hand against her friend and deserved only death for it. The strong blow threw the guy far to the side, and he broke through the stone slab with his whole body, falling onto it. After Henry's blow, Vincent could still get up and fight, but now he couldn't even move his hand. At first, Henry thought Vincent had died after Julia's first blow, although he was not sure. Jimmy had never seen Julia's full power in action either, but had only heard about it from stories told by students. The girl could really scare anyone and, clutching each other, the friends could not take their eyes off what was happening. Julia then ordered her assistants to give Vincent first aid so that he would live to see a fair trial. She ordered to call for help if the guys couldn't cope on their own, and to drag the body to the infirmary. Julia realized that they couldn't do without her help and went with her assistants, saying goodbye to Henry and saying that this was not their last meeting. It seems that the girl had completely lost her mind and seriously intended to prove her love to Sophia, for whom she secretly had unchildish feelings. However, there was a man who did not need help to not only drag the huge body of the big guy along the ground, but also to lift it with one hand. Henry had the strength to easily lift Vincent by the collar and demand to know where Charlie was. The big guy didn't try to deny it, and said that Charlie and two guards took Agatha to the bar, but he didn't know what he was planning. Vincent no longer needed this student, and, upon hearing the answer, Henry let him go and he fell down. Of course, Vincent was happy that he got off with another painful fall onto the stone platform, and did not become a target for this strongest student. He then demanded that Julia's assistants immediately take him to the infirmary, because all his bones were broken, and he could not feel his body. Sophia realized that her friend was going to fight the entire clan of Charlie and his father alone, and tried to dissuade him. This guy's bodyguards were the strongest in the city, and each one had a rank of at least 10th. It is unlikely that after what happened, Henry would listen to Sophia, and the girl asked her friend to help her convince the guy. But, to her surprise, Jimmy did not dissuade Henry, but declared that he would go with him. This was certainly commendable, but Henry warned that the journey could be dangerous. But from the first day of training, Jimmy was used to getting bruises along with his friend, and was not going to make an exception. Moreover, after the fight with Vincent, the ancient Taoist technique of primordial chaos that Henry possessed strengthened and became surprisingly powerful. Of course, he should soon receive the main weapon, because the call of a new immortal warrior should take place any day now. Meanwhile, Charlie was walking around the family estate, angry that Vincent was asking 800,000 to kill some weakling. Of course, he was accompanied by his personal bodyguard, Scott, who advised the young man to contact him directly on such matters. He explained that no matter how strong an academy student was, he was no match for an experienced fighter, and that it was not worth giving orders to underachievers. This was the right advice, because any student is inferior to a real fighter who has the 15th rank of strength. Moreover, the leaders of the disciplinary committee were not ordinary students, and only they could compete in strength with Charlie's father. And Edward, the second member of the disciplinary committee, did not belong to the new clans, but had a rich pedigree. Yes, this guy's clan controlled the laws of commercial circles, and also controlled the city's underground world, which certainly connected him to crime. Charlie had heard many times that 18-year-old Edward was one of the strongest warriors, but he doubted that he could compare with the mercenaries of their security service. It seemed that today he was about to be convinced of this, because suddenly they heard loud screams from the estate. Then, right in front of them, they saw the last guard lying on the steps, covered in blood after a deadly fight. One of the guards managed to say that the guy Edward couldn't be stopped, and that he had already been on the estate's territory for 10 minutes. This was terrible news for Charlie, because he had always believed that their families got along and respected the friendly family way of life. However, there was no doubt that the attacker was Edward, because he was still in the house. Many of the guards who engaged him in combat were killed, and this man was the last to see with his own eyes everything that happened inside. The boy managed to defeat 10 cultivation stage cultivators, but it was unclear what kind of power was hidden within this psychopath. The worst part was that Charlie's father was still in his office, which meant his meeting with Edward had already taken place. Yes, Richard was not mistaken, and looked straight into the eyes of the impudent man who dared to appear alone on their estate. But explanations alone would not do, since several of the best fighters from the personal guard of the owner of the estate died because of him. In response to this, the boy greeted his uncle with a slight smile and asked for forgiveness for the unexpected visit. He regretted his tactlessness with the estate's security, but he had come here to discuss an important matter concerning trade. However, Richard had never seen Edward in such a mood before, and did not expect that he would kill guards for the sake of a simple conversation. The young man explained this by saying that he had long been tired of formalities, and wanted to have a little fun in a real fight. He then declared that all assets of the two families should henceforth belong only to him, and he wanted to take the post of CEO of the underground business. One could expect anything from this naughty boy, but the chairman of the board were furious when they heard such impudence. Only Richard remained calm and merely clarified where they had crossed the path of the eldest member of Edward's family. But the young man corrected himself, saying that he did not wish any harm to Richard's family, but simply wanted to clarify the situation immediately. He just wanted every member of the family to obey only him, and to be confident that he was worthy of this small concession from them. For a while there was silence in the room, and it was unclear whether this boy was in his right mind, or had simply gone mad. Realizing that this child had completely lost his mind, everyone burst into loud laughter, realizing that he had thought too much of himself. Besides, there was a man present who knew how to easily solve such problems, and was ready to put the boy in his place right now. Looking at him, the chief agent of the personal security stated that the strength and authority of the assessors were much more significant than the stupid character of a worthless boy. Placing a heavy hand on his shoulder, the agent declared that the boy was risking his life if he didn't get out of here immediately. But what the members of the board saw the next moment shocked even the most seasoned. Richard was sure that the big guy could not be moved, but the young man managed to do something more. After his blow, the agent flew far to the side and blood gushed from his mouth as if he was at his last breath, and he slowly put on his glasses, which he had taken off only so as not to ruin them during the short fight. Then, he asked not to show such tricks anymore and to go straight to the essence of his proposal, so as not to waste time. It seemed that after such an argument, it was difficult to refuse a guy who could kill the best agents of the family with one blow. The sounds of the fight could be heard even outside, and Charlie, who was still there, knew that things were getting worse. After all, right now his father's life was under threat, and the guy rushed into the office where this tough interview was taking place. Directly in front of him, he saw that all the agents and members of the delegation were scattered in the corners, and only Richard was still standing on his feet, pressed against the wall. Seeing his son at the other end of the hall, he loudly ordered him to stand still and not come closer. But if Edward had seriously wanted this, he could easily catch up with Charlie, even if he tried to hide. Adjusting his round glasses, he realized that Richard's son had arrived just in time, and that this would be the main argument to persuade his father to make the right decision. Turning to Charlie, he greeted the boy he had always called his little brother. But Charlie couldn't understand what had happened here, and why a member of a friendly family was suddenly acting like a bitter enemy. Suddenly, Edward reminded him that not only his life, but also the fate of the rest of the family members depended on Richard's answer right now. Realizing that he had no choice, Richard suddenly loudly asked his son to carry out all the orders that Edward would give him from now on. Now Charlie had to find this guy some beautiful girls who were ready to serve him and fulfill all his whims. And all the shares, previously divided between several influential families, now belonged to Edward alone, along with the family business. For the first few seconds, Charlie couldn't believe his ears, and didn't understand whether it was true or if he was just dreaming. And he said with a smile that his uncle had made the right decision and turned out to be much smarter than it might seem. Even after making this difficult decision, Richard could not understand why Edward had taken it into his head to commit this crazy act, and who had prompted him to take this step. It turned out that the guy was tired of putting up with weaklings walking over his heads and wanted to get rid of this obstacle once and for all. From an early age, Edward believed that people only needed strength to cause pain, as the boy was often subjected to brutal beatings by his father. That was why he had no desire to enter the academy and become a cultivator, although his parents insisted. But the day he went out into the street and refused to give money to local hooligans, he changed his mind, and this became the beginning of his long journey in learning magic. Seeing Tony and his accomplices beating up the unfortunate boy, he rushed towards them, demanding that they stop immediately. However, in response, he heard only laughter, because his father had absolutely no power, and Edward could not influence anything. To take this step, Edward had to overcome himself, because the boy was barely holding back his fear and was trembling like a leaf. That day he also got it, because the guys didn't like arrogant people who thought they were heroes and taught others how to live right. Only now, having received a blow to the face, Edward realized how important it is to be strong and be able to stand up for himself and for others. Moreover, Tony suddenly admitted that in this world, it is force that is the mind, because only force determines who will have the last word. And then, having said this, he kicked the boy again with all his might right in the face and demanded that he give him all the money. Then he got scared and immediately gave the boys his wallet tightly stuffed with bills. And then he started running, and for the first time in his life, he surrendered in the face of real physical force. After this, the bullying did not stop, and it became clear that the more you give in to the bullies, the more brazen they become. And again, the situation repeated itself when the guys continued to bully the same boy who brought them too little money. Edward had to watch the brutal massacre from the sidelines, but he didn't have a single chance to deal with the entire crowd. At that moment, looking sternly at the leader, he promised that tomorrow he would steal more money from the father if they let the boy go. Tony cheerfully said that he was ready to accept his offer, unless Edward wanted to pull the wool over his eyes. And the other one, his friend, slapped Edward's face with his palms and threatened to kill him if the boy decided to do something stupid. When they left, the boy immediately asked for forgiveness for the fact that, due to his fault, Edward had to pay money not only for himself, but also for him. But he did not want to remain as weak as this boy, and told him that from now on, he no longer considered him his friend. He was no longer going to endure humiliation from some underage idiots who knew nothing except how to extort money from the weak. From then on, his long search for unprecedented mastery began, and, to the delight of his parents, he began to diligently study the art of cultivation. His skills grew day by day, and soon he achieved a level of mastery that his peers could only dream of. In order to take revenge on every scoundrel who stood in his way, he went through all the stages of training and was ready to show what he was capable of. Luckily, he came across a crowd of boys who had been bullying him recently, but now they were becoming his victims. Even the boys' look changed greatly, and he needed more victories in battles to increase his level. Now he was ready to personally eradicate the forces lurking in this world, so that people could not use them for violence. And now Edward, as an adult, was one of the strongest cultivators and had fought many times in his life, winning again and again. Meanwhile, fulfilling his father's orders, Charlie announced the imminent arrival of a very beautiful academy student who would surely please the new owner of their business. This was great news, and after that Edward suggested that he move on without wasting time getting ready. At this point, Henry and his friend were chatting happily about everything that had happened in the last few days, and Jimmy was happy about his friend's rapid level growth. Unexpectedly, Jimmy told him the truth about who really owned the underground black market and pharmacy chain where he first created the elixir in public view. There were only 2 clans in the city, sharing control over the entire underground world, and each clan played its own role in the common cause. Catherine was always not only attractive, but also the smartest lady, who rightfully got a serious role in the family business. For her strict nature, she was nicknamed the femme fatale, although in appearance she could seem sweet and confuse anyone. Meanwhile, they arrived at one of the bars where they often liked to spend their evenings and watch the dance floor with the most attractive beauties of the city. Suddenly, the guy noticed a girl not far from him who had clearly had too much to drink and was barely holding back. At some point, she lost her balance, and Henry realized that in a second she would collapse to the floor. Of course, the guy couldn't allow this and stepped forward to pick up the girl in his arms. But, unfortunately, he put his hands forward and his palms landed right on her chest, which from the outside did not look at all like Henry had intended. The guy immediately apologized and explained that he just wanted to help after seeing her trip. But instead of gratitude, the girl showered him with insults, demanding that he remove his dirty hands and not touch where he was not allowed. Jimmy knew from the start that his friend only wanted to help her, so he stepped forward and started yelling loudly at her in response. Besides, if she is proud of her feminine charms, the guy has made it clear that his chest is bigger, although not as attractive. The argument seemed to have gone off track, and Henry changed the subject by asking where in the establishment Charlie could be found. But such an unexpected address to her from Jimmy greatly amused her, and she did not expect that Henry had such a funny friend. And then she threw herself on his neck and told him that Charlie was now on the 3rd floor, in the most expensive box of the establishment. At some point, Henry realized that the girl was hinting at intimacy and hastened to stop her, because he had a lot of important things to do. And then, as he was about to leave, he told her one last thing, that he and Charlie had never been friends. To her horror, the guy admitted that he was only here to kill the bastard and cleanse this world of at least one degenerate. One can only guess what thoughts were swarming through her head after the confession. But the intoxication obviously disappeared without a trace. After a short time, he found himself where Charlie was supposed to spend his time, realizing that he was close to his goal. But instead of a student, he saw a whole crowd of guys blocking the way, and it was difficult to understand how to squeeze through. According to the girl, the entertainment area for important people was on the 3rd floor. But entry was only by invitation and had to be done in advance. Realizing that there was no other way out, Jimmy walked straight into the crowd and asked everyone to move aside and let them pass. And then, being among the other guests, he cheerfully shouted that he had found Charlie. But this time he was not alone. It turned out that the scoundrel had angrily attacked Agatha, whom he considered the culprit of all his troubles and recent public disgrace. The girl looked so bad that it was disgusting to approach her, so the guy kept his distance. She swore that it was the first time in her life that she had drunk so much and begged Charlie to let her go home to get herself together. And although Henry did not forget the vile act when she set him up in front of the whole class, he felt a little sorry for the student. However, Charlie could not calm down and demanded that the girl drink the remaining whiskey in the glass, as Edward demanded. But after drinking alcohol, she had a severe stomachache, and if she continued drinking, she would die in front of everyone. Only now did Henry realize that the bullying of the student was started by Edward, who was sitting alone in the most expensive room. There was a feeling that the guy was clearly not himself, because no one in their right mind would think of mocking a woman for pleasure. There were a lot of empty bottles on the table, and anyone in Agatha's place would have felt ill if they had drunk the contents alone. This amount of alcohol could be fatal if Agatha doesn't get to the hospital in time. But instead of calling an ambulance,